Good morning, everyone. I don't think can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. I know. I'm trying to signal the audio. Good morning, everyone. If everyone could take their seats. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Justice's 2020 National Opioid Summit. I'm Amanda Liskam, an Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General and the Director of Opioid Enforcement and Prevention Efforts. I'm honored to be here with you today as we discuss our successes in helping stem the flow of opioids in this country and how we can more effectively combat this crisis. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Deputy Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today. At this time, I would ask that everyone please rise for the United States Navy Color Guard and the singing of the national anthem performed by Chief Dave Sigmund, a U.S. Navy band vocalist. Advance the colors.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Post the colors. Please be seated, and thank you to the United States Navy Color Guard and Chief Sigmund for that wonderful rendition of the national anthem. We are so grateful for your presence here today and hope that you enjoy the program that we have in store for you for the next 2.5 days. A special thank you to EOUSA for their tremendous support in putting this summit together. I would also note that your agendas that you should have found on your seats show that the Attorney General will be speaking with you this morning. While this issue is a high priority for the Attorney General, he is unfortunately unavailable this morning, but he is scheduled to speak with you ahead of the Friday's headline speaker and is very much looking forward to addressing you then. The fight against the opioid crisis is one of the highest priorities of the Department of Justice and the entire administration. Our department-wide efforts are in fact key elements of our broader strategy for combating not only this crisis, but the threat posed by transnational organized crime. Our leadership measures our performance by whether we help bring the death toll down. Our Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General have set the tone, and it's inspiring to witness the hard work and dedication of our employees across the Department of Justice. Today, we're here to discuss our efforts to stem this epidemic through reducing the supply as well as the demand. This summit brings together United States attorneys, federal, state, and local officials, government and public health officials, policy leaders, and most importantly, families who have lost their loved ones to this vicious epidemic. Throughout this summit, we will have the opportunity to reflect on the obstacles we've overcome, on the new ground we're breaking every day, and on the challenges that still lie ahead as we work together to combat this crisis. At this time, it's my honor to introduce Deputy Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen. He has spent 30 years as a litigator in private practice, handling cases all across the country. He is magna cum laude graduate from Harvard Law School, and for several years was an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, where he taught professional responsibility. Previously, he served in a prior administration as general counsel of 2 different federal cabinet agencies, the Department of Transportation and OMB. He has also served the last 3 years as the number 2 official at 2 different cabinet departments, first as Deputy Secretary at the Department of Transportation, and now as Deputy Attorney General here at the Department of Justice. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Deputy Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen.
Thank you, Amanda, for the nice introduction. Good morning. It's so wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues here. I want to thank everybody from coming from all over the country to attend this important summit. That so many of you have taken the time to be here is a testament to the gravity of our subject. I'm honored to be here speaking with you as we discuss the Department of Justice's efforts to address our nation's opioids crisis. Since the year 2000, more than 400,000 people have lost their lives due to opioids. This staggering number of deaths has pushed drug overdoses to the top of the list of the leading causes of death for Americans under the age of 50 years old, and it's caused a decline of 2.5 months from U.S. life expectancy. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, more than 67,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in the year 2018 alone, and more than 2/3 of those were caused by heroin, fentanyl, and prescription opioids. Now, thanks to the leadership of President Trump, in March of 2018, the administration released the Initiative to Stop Opioid Abuse and Reduce Drug Supply and Demand, and since then, the number of fatalities has declined last year for the first time in more than 25 years. However, I think everyone in this room knows we still have a lot of work to do. Our department has no higher priority than keeping the American people safe. So addressing this issue is at the top of our agenda. The Attorney General reminds us of it often, and is one of those issues that's always on our radar. The other aspect that I'd note right from the outset is this is truly a department-wide effort, with everyone from the DEA, FBI, and our U.S. attorneys taking part, and throughout the department, and of course colleagues elsewhere in the government. I'm grateful for the work all of you do every day in this area. You're all on the front lines working to defeat what seems like just an endless stream of drug traffickers and some really disgraceful doctors who intentionally overprescribe for profit. We would not be able to fight this fight without our U.S. attorneys and our opioids coordinators in every district. Your work with national, state, and local law enforcement is just so important and so valuable. Your tireless devotion is one of the many reasons that the administration has made the progress we have in combating this issue. This overall effort has been successful in implementing the initiatives on opioids to date, and we are seeing success. One such initiative is focused on dismantling darknet websites that allow some of the most prolific drug suppliers to peddle their poisons. In 2018, or beginning in 2018, the FBI established the Joint Criminal Opioid and Darknet Enforcement Team, also known as J-Code. Since J-Code's launch, there have been 2 successful, very large-scale busts that have taken hundreds of kilograms of drugs off the streets and dozens of darknet accounts offline. These darknet investigations will be further discussed during the summit. Another really important and noteworthy department initiative is Operation Synthetic Opioid Surge, or SOS, which focuses on illicit opioids in 10 districts with some of the highest opioids overdose death rates in the country. Our goal in those districts is prosecuting all readily provable cases involving synthetic opioids and to identify wholesale distribution methods. In the first year of the program, over 300 cases were charged in just these 10 districts, with many of the cases focusing on cases where the dealers were prosecuted for selling fentanyl that had resulted in an overdose death. We've seen many of the SOS districts charging the death-resulting cases where a drug dealer is held accountable for a fatal overdose. And indeed, there will be a presentation about this later in the summit as well. In addition, as another important initiative, the department has created the Appalachian Regional Prescription Opioid Strike Force, or the affectionate nickname ARPO, which is a joint law enforcement effort that pools the resources and expertise of multiple agencies to identify, investigate, and prosecute healthcare fraud schemes in the Appalachian region, which of course is one of the areas hardest hit by the opioid epidemic. Since its establishment in 2018, ARPO has charged more than 70 defendants across more than a dozen districts who are collectively responsible for distributing more than 40 million pills. These defendants were often medical professionals who were charged with Title 21 offenses, which carry very stiff penalties. So as you will hear during the summit, the ARPO Strike Force has also worked in partnership with HHS to ensure that when there is a takedown of dishonest medical professionals, patients are met by a team of public health officials who can refer them to legitimate medical providers or, if appropriate, addiction recovery services. Another approach to stop the illegal flow of prescription opioids, the department's Consumer Protection Branch in the Civil Division has dusted off a statutory provision that had been virtually unused as the crisis was worsening over the last decade, and the department has sought civil injunctions under the Controlled Substances Act to stop the unlawful prescribing and dispensing of controlled substances. For example, when DEA data showed that 2 pharmacies in a small Tennessee town were dispensing enough opioids to supply a mid-sized city, we successfully enjoined the 2 pharmacies, their majority owner, and 3 pharmacists from continuing to dispense controlled substances. The complaint also sought monetary penalties and then was followed by a criminal action against one of the pharmacists. Unless wrongdoers get the message and stop this kind of activity, you can look for DOJ to bring many similar actions in the coming year. Now, due in part to the tremendous efforts by the Department of Justice and by our components and our colleagues at DEA, at FBI, DHS, USPIS, HHS, and others, we're starting to see some key results. For the second year in a row, there has been a decline in overdose deaths in the United States. Though the decline is modest, it is remarkable considering that we have historically seen, since 1990, a steady increase in overdose deaths. So reversing that deadly trend is a very important mark of progress. In addition, the DEA has also reduced by nearly 50% the aggregate production quota for 7 of the most frequently diverted controlled substance opioids since 2016. The number of prescriptions for those 7 opioids has decreased by more than 33% since 2017. This is a welcome relief after a steady increase in the overall national opioid prescribing rate that had started increasing in 2006. As another mark of progress, DEA's seizures of fentanyl have increased since 2016 by over 700%, a 7-fold increase. The department's prosecution of opioid-related offenses has reached record levels with more than 11,000 opioid prosecutions in the last fiscal year alone. And as you will hear today and during the summit, there will be no let-up in our efforts to combat this plague. Our successes, however, do not stop with these critical efforts that all of you have made in implementing the department's enforcement initiatives. Indeed, perhaps one of the administration's most imperative steps was the President's recent signing of the Temporary Reauthorization and Study of the Emergency Scheduling of Fentanyl Analogs Act. That's a mouthful. But what it does is it provides a 15-month extension of DEA's scheduling order of all fentanyl-like substances on a class-wide basis. And I don't need to tell all of you how important that legislation is. After all, an important part of what made it happen is that many of you engaged in education, in outreach efforts, wrote op-eds, issued statements, gave interviews, and explained the need for not only a temporary extension, but of permanent legislation to ban fentanyl analogs. The department's goal, of course, is to enforce our drug laws and keep these poisons off our streets. But ultimately, we are striving to keep more of our fellow Americans alive. We can't do that if the deadliest drugs fall outside of our laws. Now, while not every district has experienced the full wrath of fentanyl and its analogs, far too many districts have been inundated with these drugs, some of which can be up to 10,000 times more potent than morphine. So I want to personally thank all of you who contribute every day to the department's greater causes, regardless of whether your district is experiencing the same challenge as your neighbors, or if you are one of the ones who have other challenges but support the department's overall efforts. Either way, you are an important contributor to what we're trying to accomplish. And your support is critical to all of the department's achievements, but for example, and in particular, obtaining the 15-month extension of the legislation to ban the fentanyl analogs. And I have no doubt we will see another united effort when the time comes to again address legislation calling for a permanent ban. So, as federal prosecutors, those of you here who are federal prosecutors, let me say, you are the best in your field, and your number of successful prosecutions speaks for themselves. And as if that wasn't enough, in addition to the successful prosecutions, many of you are tackling the crisis outside the courtroom as well. You work to better inform the public about the dangers of opioids. You speak on panels, you speak to school children, you speak to vulnerable populations about the dangers of opioids. In your offices, your law enforcement coordinators are working regularly with your local and state partners to ensure that your federal resources are doing the most that they can to help the populations that we all serve. Your victim witness staff work with individuals who are the most impacted by this epidemic. You are all part of a community that is making a difference in people's lives every day. You help to protect the public, You help to stop the promoters of poison. You help to preserve lives that might be lost. So as we get this summit underway today, while we all know that there is much more to be done, I want to thank you, and the entire department owes you its thanks, for your unwavering devotion to doing all that we can to end this terrible opioids affliction. Our work continues. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you again to Deputy Attorney General Rosen. We really appreciate your comments today. He is obviously very busy and so will be departing us at this point, but he will be back on Friday to join us. We are going to take a brief pause here so that we can set up for our first panel, and we will start that panel at 9 o'clock, so don't go too far. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're going to get started again. These mics don't work. Thank you, everyone. We're going to get started back up again. If everyone could take their seats, we're going to start the next panel. Very fancy. All right, we're going to begin the next panel. This panel will be discussing the issues of reducing the supply of opioids into this country. The panel will be moderated by Seth Ducharme, who is the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, where he coordinates and helps implement the department's priorities and efforts across all of the department's components, U.S. Attorney's offices, and law enforcement agencies. Prior to serving as PAYDAG, Seth served as the counselor to the Attorney General Barr. He previously served as the chief of the criminal division for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of New York. And prior to attending law school, Seth was a deputy U.S. Marshal in Brooklyn, New York. Please join me in welcoming PAYDAG Seth Ducharme and our first panel of the day.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Mic distance is key here. Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks to you and your team for putting this conference together. It's my pleasure to be here and be joined by such a distinguished panel. I know these folks are well known to most of you, but just to briefly go through their bios, Brian Benchkowski is the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. In that capacity, he supervises the Criminal Division's more than 600 prosecutors in 16 sections, conducting investigations and prosecutions involving healthcare, opioid-related fraud, international narcotics trafficking, cybercrime, money laundering, and many other crimes. Mr. Benchkowski comes to the division with over 10 years of public service experience in the federal government, having served in a variety of leadership positions both in the Department of Justice and on Capitol Hill. Justin Herdman, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio, is also the Vice Chair of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. Justin has served as U.S. Attorney since 2017. He leads an office of 200 personnel dedicated to addressing a wide range of threats to a district of almost 6 million people. Previously served as the Justice Department as an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the district he now heads, and is a current Judge Advocate in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. I'm also joined by Udom Dillon, Acting Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Mr. Dillon was appointed DEA's Acting Administrator on July 2nd, 2018 by the Attorney General. Before coming to DEA, Mr. Dillon served as an Assistant United States Attorney in the Central District of California, Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Department of Justice, and as Deputy Counsel and Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States. Also joined by Terry Wade. Terry is the Executive Assistant Director of the FBI's Criminal, Cyber Response and Services Branch. In January, Terry was appointed as the FBI's EAD. In this role, he oversees all FBI criminal and cyber investigations worldwide, international operations, critical incident response, and victim assistance. Prior to his current role, Mr. Wade served as the Assistant Director of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division. So it's a great pleasure to be joined by these folks, and the focus of our panel is going to be understanding the threat of opioids, the substance, and the people who traffic in that substance, and to talk about the tactics, strategies, and particular techniques that the department is using to combat this serious problem. So, Udom, I'll start with you. In 2017, the White House declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency. Since that time, the federal government has taken unprecedented steps to confront the opioid crisis and criminals who are profiting from the misery and death caused by it. But before we can have this conversation, I think it's important just to start with the fundamentals for this audience. So as an initial matter, opioid's a buzzword we throw around a lot now, but what is an opioid within the meaning of the Controlled Substance Act and within the context of the legal remedies that we're talking about today?
So the Controlled Substances Act has 5 distinct categories or schedules where we place drugs, with Schedule 1 being the ones with the highest potential for abuse and where there's no medical use for the drug. And opioids fall into various categories along that continuum. An opioid is essentially a drug that you can become addicted to that is similar to morphine. That's how it's described in the Controlled Substances Act. There were very broad categories of opioids, though, and they don't really fall neatly into any particular category because we both have legal and illegal opioids. So the legal opioids are prescription opioids that you could get for pain relief, and they're drugs you've heard of before, hydrocodone, oxycodone, codeine, morphine, and fentanyl are legal opioids, where illegal opioids are heroin and when manufactured illegal things like fentanyl. The reason they don't fall neatly into any categories is because many of these opioids are prescription drugs that, if prescribed by a medical practitioner under a medical practitioner's supervision, can alleviate pain, can be life-saving drugs, whereas the illegal drugs, when abused, are life-taking drugs. So we have 2 categories of these drugs to deal with from a DEA perspective. The prescription medications are the kind that we can regulate through our regulatory function. We regulate the amount of those drugs that can be manufactured. We register anybody who can prescribe or handle those drugs, such as doctors and pharmacists. So we have a regulatory function over the prescription drugs. And of course, we use our criminal enforcement function to attack illegal heroin and illegal fentanyl and other illegal opioids.
Thanks very much. Brian, turn to you, just going through your introduction. I mean, you oversee so many components in the criminal division that could touch on directly or indirectly the threats coming from the substances that Udom is describing. And you're seeing data come in from all those components in the U.S. Attorney's Office. What are you seeing, and why has the criminal division dedicated so many resources to combating the opioid problem?
I think that the first thing that is so striking in this crisis are the human costs, the devastating human costs. I've traveled around. There are many U.S. attorneys here. They know their districts well. I've had an opportunity to get out into the country, and I think about people like a woman named Stacey Archer, who I met in West Virginia at a round table, and she and her husband, Wendell, lost their son, Joel, to opioid addiction. And they spent a lot of time talking to me about how they channeled their grief and their concern, and they created an organization that allowed people to come together who had experienced similar tragedies as a support network. And there are literally tens of thousands of Stacey's and Joel's in the United States. And so when you go out and you see that, it is the human cost of this epidemic are just striking. And it caused us to focus in the criminal division on the threat. And what is the threat that we're seeing in the division? By and large, our focus, although not entirely, has been, as the Deputy Attorney General mentioned, our strike force in the Appalachian region. And we are focused on dirty doctors and healthcare professionals who are prescribing prescription opioids largely for profit. And there's a doctor I think of in Hurricane, West Virginia, who would get calls from patients on his cell phone and issue them opioid prescriptions in the parking lot or at a gas station in Hurricane, never once actually examining the patients, selling those prescriptions for cash. I think of a doctor in another part of West Virginia where the DEA executed a search warrant on his medical practice, and there we seized not only the evidence of the illicit prescription of opioids, but 73 firearms, and we also found a room that included a plunge pool and a large pornography studio where the doctor was actually filming pornography with his drug-addicted so-called patients. And I also think of a trial victory that we just had, the very first ARPO trial victory that we had in Mike Donovan's district in Memphis. An 81-year-old doctor, Richard Farmer, a psychiatrist, who was convicted of 3 counts of distributing controlled substances, for prescribing oxycodone to his patients, remarkably at age 81, in exchange for sexual acts and other behavior, also cash. So when you see that kind of behavior across the country in various districts, what we're seeing is actually just drug dealing, but with lab coats and nice ties and a medical license on the wall. And so we've dedicated a tremendous amount of resources directed at targeting those types of defendants. And I'll talk a little bit more, I think, a little bit later about what we're doing in the computer crime and intellectual property section, where we are doing a tremendous amount of work on the dark web, working with our U.S. attorney counterparts and federal law enforcement to identify parts of the dark web where prescription opioids, fentanyl, other illicit substances, and other criminal activity is occurring.
Thanks very much, Brian. So you went through a number of examples that maybe would not be the most conventional examples that our team might expect when you think about what you correctly describe as fundamentally drug dealing. The more conventional, probably, expectation of drug dealing is the core sort of designated drug trafficking organization, cartel type of case that DEA and our other partners have specialized in for many years, and it fuels the public consciousness. The show Narcos, certainly the Chapo trial. So Udom, if we can go back to you for a minute and just focus on I don't want to say conventional, but more familiar threat of drug dealing through the cartels and organizations like that. What are you seeing there, and how does opioid trafficking fit into the model of those enterprises?
These drug cartels are largely located in Mexico. They're Mexican drug trafficking organizations. They are global drug trafficking organizations, and they are poly-drug trafficking organizations. And opioids are a significant part of what they bring into our country to poison our communities. DEA puts out a report each year, and over the last few years, we have said that these transnational criminal organizations constitute the most significant drug threat to the U.S. I actually sometimes believe they constitute the most significant criminal threat to the U.S. because they bring with them violence and death into all of their communities. Drugs are associated with almost every gang and many violent acts that we face every day in our communities. So it has a very widespread impact in our communities. And of course, as has been mentioned previously, these criminal enterprises kill literally tens of thousands of Americans every year. What are they bringing into the country? Heroin. We sometimes forget about heroin, but heroin is about 90% of the heroin that comes to the U.S. comes from Mexico, and it's brought in by these drug trafficking organizations. We've seen a slight decrease over the last year or so of the amount of heroin being brought in, but it's been offset easily by the huge amount of fentanyl that these drug trafficking organizations are bringing in. And perhaps most dangerously, fentanyl is a synthetic drug, which means these drug trafficking organizations are capable of manufacturing it in Mexico. They have a very sophisticated methamphetamine manufacturing system in Mexico, and we anticipate and expect that they'll be able to do exactly the same with fentanyl. One of the other things they do is they're focused on the precursor chemicals. We've been effective in keeping precursor chemicals, working with some of our foreign counterparts from getting into Mexico that they use to make fentanyl, but the Mexican drug traffickers are looking at developing their own precursor chemicals. So they're very creative, they're very aggressive, and we should anticipate that we will continue to see an aggressive effort on their part to manufacture fentanyl in a variety of forms, pill form and other forms, and illegally bring them into the United States.
Thanks very much, Udom. Terry, turning to you for a moment, I can barely see you down there at the end of the table, but I mean, you have so much responsibility in your current position as EAD over a division in the FBI that covers both violent gangs, cyber activity, darknet, and what we're hearing on the panel is that, the substance is dangerous, the people are dangerous, and the instrumentalities that are used to distribute could include everything from a gang kid on the corner to a darknet forum. So in that area, gangs and perhaps darknet, what are you seeing from your position in FBI, and why has it become a rising priority for your sections?
Thank you. As Adam hit on, the regular cartels are obviously a part of this, but what you hit on was very important there, that the normal distribution of this we see proliferated through the dark net. Mr. Rosen hit on it a little bit there, and there's so many great uses of the internet and the way we do commerce now. And a lot of it has to do with ease. It's very easy to sit at home and order things through Amazon or wherever, all the legitimate sites you can go to, from your groceries to your clothes, where you don't have to leave your home to do these things. One of the things that follows with that is, of course, criminal activity. And now, just like you can order groceries at home, you can order drugs, illicit narcotics, counterfeit prescription drugs. And one of the big dangers that Mr. Rosen hit on a little bit was with the prescription drug abuse and the counterfeit drug abuse. And the lethality of fentanyl, of course, is one of the huge issues that we see with that. So he mentioned J-code, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about here as we move along here. And staying up with the criminals, where the money is where they will go. And one of the challenges for us as we conduct these investigations into the darknet is their utilization of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and other things that are very hard to trace. So we have to adapt and evolve in these investigations, and we're doing a good job with that, as many of the prosecutors here have been involved in a number of these investigations. And it takes time, but as Mr. Rosen said, we've had a number of successes. He hit on a couple of the big takedowns we've had with the J-code and then the Appalachian Task Force that he talked about, trying to be at least keeping up, if not ahead of the criminals on this.
Great, thanks. So Justin, of all of us up here, you're closer to the problem in the field. I mean, we're all visiting the field, but most of the data that comes into Main Justice and the headquarters components is being reported from the field. So from the vantage point of the U.S. Attorney's Office and the community where you work and live, and the access you have to the people in the community, the local partners, victims, what's your perspective on the harm caused in the community by opioids?
This is a harm that is going to be felt by generations of young people in places like Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, New Hampshire, California. These are all people in their 20s who've probably been to more funerals in their short lifetimes than most of us have in our lifetimes. That's just the reality of what we're dealing with in our communities. We, in Ohio, since 2010, over 25,000 Ohioans have died as a result of unintentional drug overdoses. So what does that mean? I mean, those are sheer numbers that are really stunning, but this is felt on a very deeply personal level by everybody in our office. You heard we have 200 employees in our office. There's not one of us who hasn't been affected in some way by this crisis. It could be directly, could be indirectly, but we have people in our office who have lost friends, who have lost relatives, who know people who are suffering through addiction. We have friends of our children who have passed away. So again, this is a very deeply personal thing for most of us in the U.S. Attorney's community. It's very frequent when I speak in public, people line up after I talk, and I can usually tell when somebody wants to address with me the loss of a loved one. It's very obvious to me because I can see the pain in their eyes, and those are very difficult conversations. And there's, so like I said, it's the kind of thing that we're reminded of all the time. But on the flip side of that, it does motivate us, and it does provide us with real enthusiasm about our work because we can see the difference that we've made. We can relay that difference to the community directly. And when we go out into our various communities and we see that there's not a corner of a neighborhood in any city in our communities that has not been affected by this crisis, we can go about talking about the great work of the Department of Justice, the great work that you've already heard about this morning, and continue to tell the folks who rely on us that we're in their corner and we're behind them.
Thanks. So let's stay with you for a minute. So we've established, I mean, to the extent there was any doubt, that we're facing a dangerous substance a significant threat and complicated distribution channels. So when you come in as the U.S. Attorney and you're getting briefed on these different threats that your community's facing, and you have to prioritize, and you really are expected to do everything, right? You can't just only do opioids. So when you learned about the problems in your community as the U.S. Attorney, what was your approach in the office to sort of marshaling resources and efficiently tackling that?
To sum it up, it was all hands on deck, that there was not one person in our office, as I just said, who was not going to be asked to contribute in some way. So we're very open in terms of soliciting ideas from anyone in our office. It could be our IT person, it could be somebody who's a legal assistant, it could be our attorneys. And they've come up with some very good ideas about ways that we can identify strategies for trying to combat parts of this crisis. And so our enforcement efforts, obviously they're focused mostly on reducing the supply, both on the illicit side, as alluded to by Udom, but also on the legal prescribing of pills, which are obviously the pathway to addiction for most. But it also required us to take a look at what we were doing on the civil side and to make sure that all of our attorneys in the office were contributing in some way to addressing this crisis. So if you start with a relatively simple idea, which is if somebody has contributed to another person's death as a result of their drug dealing, those are overdose death cases that we can prosecute on the federal level. Obviously, with 25,000 deaths in a state, that would be an overwhelming amount of prosecutions for us to handle. So we have to partner with our locals to ensure that state prosecutors have access to the best evidence that they can use in their prosecutions, and that we can also prioritize federal prosecutions in a way where we start with the unfortunate incident where you've had somebody pass away. That person is essentially has evidence of drug dealing that's further up the chain. And it's very common where we see one overdose death that there's a dealer in common with several overdose deaths. They may be selling a particular pressed pill out of carfentanil or fentanyl. They may be selling a fentanyl cocaine mix. They may be selling a heroin fentanyl mix that is common to several deaths or non-fatal overdoses. And once we're in a position to work with our local partners to identify those overdose victims, then we can work with our federal agency partners, DEA, FBI, HSI, to find that broader network and to identify those people today who are killing people on our streets today and move as quickly as we can. That's been a very effective strategy for us, is to try to prioritize those dealers who have several overdoses in common and to prosecute them on the federal level.
Great, thanks. So Udom, I'll come back to you for a second. I mean, if our collective goal is to defeat our enemies, essentially, the people who are pushing this poison into our communities. You talked a little bit about the cartels at the beginning, but if we can get to a little bit of a more concrete level now, to understand that enemy and the tactics and techniques that they're employing, particularly in the southwest border, to understand and defeat that enemy, what's important for this audience to know about how those groups are operating?
The first thing I would say is it's important to recognize, and I think probably everybody in this room would concur in this, but I'm not sure there was universal agreement on this until we experienced the opioid crisis. Supply matters. One of the things we've learned from the opioid crisis is that when you increase supply of a drug, addiction and overdose deaths go up. I'm not sure people fully appreciated that before. Don't get me wrong, prevention's critical. Prevention may be the most critical because if you can keep people from even using drugs, that would solve a huge amount of the problem. And treatment's critical. But I think supply matters. And if supply matters, enforcement really matters. What everybody, all the U.S. attorneys are doing, what DEA is doing, what FBI is doing, what all federal, state, local, tribal law enforcement are doing is critical to effectively attacking this problem. The supply problem we largely have is along the southwest border coming from Mexican drug trafficking organizations. They have literally billions of dollars to be very, very creative. So they're constantly developing new techniques for getting drugs across the border. They're very sophisticated in terms of building hidden compartments and traps in vehicles. We have had situations, we've had intelligence that there is drugs in a vehicle, we seize the vehicle, and we literally have to take the vehicle completely apart to find the hidden compartments. That's how good they are, and they're constantly developing that technology to hide drugs just coming through what appears to be normal vehicles. they're suspending drugs in liquid. We're seeing a lot of methamphetamine suspended in liquid now, and then there are labs here that will then turn that into the crystal meth. It's suspended in liquid because it can be transported looking like something else. Tunnels under the border. That's obviously an important issue. A tunnel was recently discovered that was very sophisticated. So the traffickers have enormous amounts of money to build very sophisticated tunnels to not just bring drugs, but for human trafficking and other contraband. We see unmanned aerial vehicles. We see ultralights, people literally flying just across the border, either landing and distributing the drugs or just dumping the drugs, just dropping the drugs and then to be picked up. We've even seen catapults, so just sort of literally launching the drugs over the border. Recently, we had a meth case in Atlanta where meth was disguised to look like candles. They disguised it to look like industrial equipment, heavy industrial equipment that you would never imagine would be actually hollow and loaded with drugs. Figurines, various figurines that you would purchase for even your children are filled with drugs, fire extinguishers. Anything that can contain drugs, the drug trafficking organizations are very sophisticated at. Car batteries that will actually have a charge so that if you test the battery, it shows that it's an actual car battery, but 3/4 of it are actually empty and loaded with drugs. So these organizations are very sophisticated. They have enormous amounts of money. They have access to chemists, to engineers and the like because they can pay so much. And that's how they're moving the drugs across the border. So we have to constantly be addressing these issues. We have to be very nimble in our approach. And also, I wanted to just mention one other thing. We have to focus, and we do focus very much on the money side of this, because once the dope gets here, the most important thing for the trafficking organizations is to get the money. They're not doing this for just to move the dope. The money is the most important thing. Every single one of our cases, I tell every single office, it's critical that you follow the money, because if we can get the money, we can really hurt these drug trafficking organizations.
Great, thanks. So Brian, now we understand we've got a sophisticated set of enemies. As Justin pointed out, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, they're taking an all-hands-on-deck approach. Certainly in your division, you've taken an all-hands-on-deck approach. And if folks in the audience who are prosecutors in the field might wonder, what's coming my way in terms of a case and conceptualizing a case or a target, not just what we see on narcos, but some of the types of unusual cases you've described. Are there any particular categories that the criminal division is focusing on? And within those categories, do you see any unique challenges for our prosecutors and partners?
Thank you for that, Seth. We are in the criminal division. I think the DAG mentioned we have 600 prosecutors in the criminal division, but the number of prosecutors who are focused on this effort in particular is roughly 25 or 30 in our fraud section, in CSIPs, and in our money laundering and asset recovery section, as well as in narcotics and dangerous drugs. But it's not a large number of prosecutors. We rely and enjoy and appreciate and need to have partnerships with U.S. attorneys' offices across the country to address these various targets. Our targets in the criminal division roughly break down into 3 categories. The worst of the worst prescribers and dispensers of prescription opioids, medical professionals and others who have essentially linked up with drug trafficking organizations locally, regionally, and nationally to move prescription opioids, and then also dark web activity through CSIPs. When you talk about the worst of the worst prescribers and dispensers, I think what's been critical in our effort is how we identify who those people are. The use of data now is as important as it's ever been in this fight. And we've taken the model that we've used over the years in investigating and prosecuting healthcare fraud, and we've imported it into this fight. And so for instance, we get data and we crunch the data and we look for certain patterns and certain categories of data tell us exactly where to look for these particular prescribers and dispensers. So, when we have prescribers who have a patient pool where the vast majority of those patients are actually receiving an opioid prescription, when you have prescribers who are prescribing cocktails of drugs that run contrary to CDC guidelines, when you have prescribers in a particular area that are writing opioid prescriptions at a rate that far exceed their peers in that particular jurisdiction, when you have prescribers who have an inordinate number of deaths of their patients that have occurred within a 60-day window. We look at the average age of the patients receiving opioid prescriptions. We look at whether or not they're getting reimbursed by federal programs, and if they're not, whether they have insurance, and if they don't, then that's a marker that there's cash that's being exchanged for these prescriptions. All of that data is available to our U.S. Attorney friends in the field, and we are able for each of our 94 districts and have put together targeting packages that identify who these prescribers are as a very, I think, an important and effective starting point for where to look. You never prosecute solely on the data, but we've been able to take the amount of time that it takes to investigate, indict, prosecute, and convict these cases down to a matter of months, when in the past it was taking years to go after doctors. The challenges are great. Prosecuting doctors is not easy. They're very much, people of respect in communities. They have the resources to hire defense counsel, and so it is not an easy task prosecuting a doctor, even some of the doctors like I've described previously here. I'll talk really quickly because I don't want to drone on here, but in the second category, we've also started to see a trend where medical professionals who have a prescription pad are linking up with drug dealing organizations in communities. There's a case in Houston that we prosecuted, 36 defendants, and it was a traditional drug trafficking organization with runners, but they had sort of combined it with what would typically look like a healthcare fraud scheme. They had recruiters who would go out and get patients, take the patients to the doctors. The runners would then take the patients who would receive their prescription to a pharmacy that was in on the scheme. They would get, large prescriptions for high intensity opioids, take the prescriptions from the patients and combine them into big buckets, give the patients a few bucks and a few prescription pills, and then divert those pills in massive quantities outside of the Houston area. And we were seeing it as far away as in Boston, those pills going from Houston to Boston. So we're starting to see more schemes like that. And then finally on the dark web, in January of this year, with the Southern District of Ohio, we announced the indictment of 5 members of one of the most prolific dark web drug trafficking DTOs, and they were distributing pressed fentanyl and other illicit drugs all across dark web marketplaces and via an encrypted chat application. So we're focusing very heavily, as Justin knows, we've done cases with his office in this space as well, on those types of targets as well.
Thanks. So clearly there's some unique challenges for dealing with the opioid problem. There's also, it sounds like, some fundamental commonalities. Criminals are principally motivated by money. Udom pointed out, follow the money. The networks, the more money that's there, the bigger the networks grow. There's low-level people, there's bosses, and there's the middle management. One other commonality, it sounds like, is the role of the darknet cyber instrumentalities in the distribution of the drugs and the sources of the evidence. So I know we started out, years ago thinking of sort of cyber, and I'm looking to you, Terry. We started out thinking of cyber years ago as almost like a niche practice. We had subject matter experts in the building. We had a few people in the U.S. Attorney's offices who were the cyber people. But now we're to a point where it's barely an overstatement to say that all crime is in some way cyber crime. The money moves, the products move, and the FBI has a primary responsibility to understand those marketplaces and those cyber threats. So with respect to opioid traffickers, how have you seen that kind of drug dealing activity evolve, as the internet has evolved and as the way the internet is used to move money and things?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You can actually see some parallels what Mr. Dillon was talking about on the drug seizures at the border and how the criminals evolve over time with the compartments, the way they mask and hide those things going. And it evolves because of investigative successes in the prosecution of those cases. And they see what isn't working and what is working. And so they get more and more sophisticated. And in the same way that they do in their masking of things that are coming straight across the border using the internet, they evolve over time. And you mentioned it touches every type of investigation. And it's funny, the way you set that up is exactly right. Cyber is viewed as a little bit of a niche at one time, and now from local investigations, there's rarely a homicide investigation that doesn't have a cyber impact, because almost all of us, the bad guys included, carry a computer in our pocket, and there are ties to that. And so with the dealers that we see on the darknet, they have evolved over time a great deal, and you see the utilization of technology like the onion router to remain anonymous over time, to make it much harder for us to track. And we see this in investigations across the board, including, of course, the sale of illicit narcotics and counterfeit prescription drug abuse. So one of the big things that they look to is to try to remain anonymous and to be able to, for us not to be able to track them. We've had success in different cases, both in the drug world and all the way to terrorism cases of tracking people down through IP addresses. So they've seen that success, and they use these anonymous sources and everything there. And then from that, another avenue we can take is, as we mentioned earlier, tracking the money. And that's the age-old thing, to follow the money, of course. And it gets more difficult through the internet with that. As I mentioned earlier, the use of cryptocurrency. And at some point, money does have to change hands. And that's kind of the end state of some of our investigations, getting to where the bad guy is actually getting paid. And it is difficult, and it takes sometimes a good deal of time, and they'll have a lot of success. And again, going back to the parallel with the shipping methods, they'll find ways to get through, and eventually we'll be able to plug that gap, and they'll move on. It's a little bit of a chess game, but we're doing well. We have a lot of really smart people and a number of different agencies. And the FBI does have a great deal of responsibility in the cyber realm, and as you mentioned, it touching every aspect of criminality. It does focus a lot of attention and helps a great deal.
Thanks. So stick with you for a minute. We've talked about understanding the threat, adapting to the threat, this kind of all hands on deck call, and the FBI has been particularly nimble and creative in trying to respond to some of the threats posed by opioid traffickers. We're here in a room with many of our partners together. If folks in Justin's office or down the hall from Brian or your partners who work with Udom, if there's things that you need your partners to know about that FBI is doing that could steer their thinking a little bit about partnering with you and developing complementary strategies. What does our audience need to know about the way FBI has responded to the threat and some of the strategies FBI has implemented?
Thanks. Mr. Rosen hit a couple on them. I do want to talk a little bit more about J-Code. I know a number of the districts out there have been involved in this, and that's a number of different federal agencies joining together across not just the Department of Justice, but DHS, United States Postal Service, and others, all gathering together. And we'd have a number of those cases. It probably hit almost every jurisdiction here. If it hasn't, watching for those type of undercover platforms that we have. It is no secret that we have undercover platforms. It's no secret because we've prosecuted those cases. And we're not really trying to keep it a secret that we're out there on the darknet looking for these things, because we believe there's a deterrent factor to that, knowing that we're out there. Conducting these type of investigations. It's a little bit of paranoia on the drug dealer's part is probably healthy for us. It makes their job a little harder. So paying attention to those undercover platforms, and those cases can take more time. So I think as far as talking about partnerships and things that we can work really well together on is the patience to get to some of those bigger takedowns that Mr. Rosen talked about through some of the task forces, through J-Code and other things. Sometimes there is, and with good reason, to take some of the low-hanging fruit and get some of the dealers off the street in your local municipalities. But taking the time to look at these enterprise investigations, deciding what the biggest targets are out there and working together to identify those. And it is a whole of government type of effort that we have to have on this. The good thing as we move through time, I think none of the agencies are looking to get all the glory on this. There's plenty of work to go around. There aren't turf battles between either the DEA, the FBI, or any of our other alphabet soup out there. Working together and making sure that we're all on the same page on that. And hitting on J-code again, I know the United States attorneys and the DOJ Maine here also take a great deal of time and effort into public awareness. One of the things I brought with me today is a pamphlet prepared by J-code, and it's called America's Opioid Crisis. And in it gives out some basic information about the opioid crisis that we've talked about today. It also talks about what to do in case of a suspected overdose. We're trying to get information out into the community to help with that. And just the overall effort that we're looking at as far as, particularly as it pertains to the darknet. So these cases are complicated. They take a lot of time, and I think just the partnerships that I've seen across the country, places that I've worked, and now that I'm responsible for oversight across the country, I think the cooperation out there is very good. There's a very aggressive United States attorneys, as Mr. Herdman was talking about. They see it in their own communities, and being able to attack it and partner there, I think there's great cooperation there, and look forward to continuing it.
Thanks, Terry. So, Udom, we've talked about, it's a serious problem. It's killing thousands of Americans. We've got all hands on deck. We've got a whole of government approach. And it sounds like we're taking really an all-tools approach. DEA clearly understands the problem and the challenge, and DEA has some tools that may not be the first to come to mind in the civil arena, the regulatory arena, in addition to the criminal investigative expertise that you have. So for this audience in particular, could you explain, some of the techniques across the all-tools spectrum that you think are going to be most effective in combating opioid trafficking?
Yes, well, this gives me an opportunity to mention the good news, which the deputy mentioned earlier, which is that overdose deaths declined for the first time in almost 30 years by about 4%. A big part of that decline was controlled prescription drug overdose deaths, which declined over 13%. And one of the things that DEA can do through its regulatory functions is it sets quotas for the amount of these controlled prescription drugs that are manufactured. And we have, as the deputy pointed out, we have reduced by a significant amount, by over 50% over the last few years, the amount of prescription medications, these addictive prescription medications that can be manufactured. What this means is we've taken all of the drugs that were being diverted or that could be diverted, we've eliminated those. Those don't exist. And this goes to my point earlier that supply matters. We determined that if we reduce the supply, we would actually reduce the addiction rate and we reduce the overdose rate, and we've seen that over the last year with an over 13% decrease. So we think that that's had a really important, significant impact. Also, educating the medical community. We've worked with HHS to talk to doctors about the overprescribing problem and have seen stunning results over the last year or so, a decrease in the prescriptions for these addictive opioids by almost 30%. So once again, we've reduced the excess production. Doctors are prescribing these less, and that's had, we think, also a significant impact in terms of addiction to prescription opioids. And again, this is regulatory as well as just talking to people and educating them about the issues. On average, every year we revoke the registrations of about 900 registrants at DEA. These are doctors and pharmacists and the like who are misusing their privilege. Sometimes they face criminal prosecution, sometimes they just face the revocation. But once we do the revocation, they're no longer able to improperly prescribe or distribute these controlled substances, and that also has an impact. And just a couple of other small things that we do. National Prescription Drug Take-Back Day, which is something that we do twice a year in April and October. That's when Americans all around the country have an opportunity to drop off their unwanted, unused, expired prescription medications at a drop-off location. In many places around the country, literally thousands of places, we have collected literally tons and tons of unwanted medications. And once again, although not all of those are addictive opioids, we think that's just another way to get those drugs out of circulation so people can't become addicted to them. So we think that just effectively using our regulatory authority and educating folks has made a huge difference this year in terms of reducing the amount of prescription drug overdoses we've seen.
Well, that's great. So it sounds like we have some effective weapons to deal with the threat we're facing, and many of those weapons would be familiar to our audience, but not necessarily all of them. So that's encouraging. Justin, I'll turn to you for a second. I mean, we've sort of just talked about the enemy, talked about some of the strategies. You talked on a local level of what you're seeing, but you also communicate, regularly with your colleagues in the U.S. Attorney community and through the AGAC. And you and your colleagues have employed some of those strategies and tactics that we've talked about on the panel today. So for the audience, could you give us sort of a quick kind of battlefield report? What are you seeing in your district, and what are you hearing from your colleagues around the country about how these tactics are working?
Well, I'll focus on a couple things. As an overall measure of effort, when you look at the volume of opioid prosecutions across the country, it has gone way up in the past couple years. And I think that's a reflection of the simple fact that in 2020, there's no such thing as a low-level fentanyl dealer. That one fentanyl dealer in one rural community can be responsible for the death of dozens of people. And we have to be in a position to prosecute those cases. And increasingly, we're seeing that in every single district across the country. That we're being very aggressive about adopting cases from our state and local partners. We're being strategic in the way that we're employing our federal resources on identifying those prioritized targets. And we are absolutely affecting the supply from the smallest communities all the way up to our biggest cities as a result of that increase in opioid prosecutions. One way that we've done that in a limited way, but in 10 different districts, we have synthetic opioid surge, where we have, each of us have picked a county where we're going to take every single synthetic opioid case out of that county, which has a huge impact on that local community. And that's a reflection of the simple fact that many state courts are so overburdened by the opioid crisis in so many different ways that it's very frequent that we'll have people bonded out after multiple fentanyl sales, car fentanyl sales, that they're back out on the street and they're dealing again after they've been arrested 4 or 5 times. They may have that many cases pending. Many of those people have been convicted several times of drug offenses, and they've never really gone to prison. So when the U.S. Attorney's Office steps in and prosecutes those people, they typically get detained, so they're not going to be dealing drugs the next day. And typically they're going to get very long prison sentences, so they're neutralized in a sense from the community and further endangering the community. We've also seen across the country, and this has been talked about a couple of different times, U.S. Attorney's offices are at the forefront of prosecuting darknet prosecutions. And that's because we really start these cases from the local level. So it could be in South Dakota, or it could be in the Western District of Texas, or Sacramento, California, Southern Mississippi. All across the country, we have people in our districts who are buying from the darknet and then are in turn selling that to people in our communities. So we really are very aggressively prosecuting these cases. And I know I'm talking to a room full of prosecutors, so I'm not talking to a room full of drug dealers. But the message is pretty simple. If you're a darknet drug dealer, I promise you, no matter how smart you think you are, you're just stupid enough that we will catch you someday. I guarantee that, because we've seen it over and over and over again. That the strategies that we're employing, more and more effective every day. And we will find these people, we will put them in jail, and they will go away for a long time. And that's what we're committed to doing out of our districts.
Thanks, Justin. So I'm going to stick with you for a moment, because we've been perhaps criminal prosecution centric in much of our discussion this morning. But we ought not to overlook that we have a significant creative talent in our civil divisions, and that, as Uda mentioned, there are, in an all-tools approach to the problem, you're going to look at regulatory approaches, civil approaches. And so could you talk about the civil side of combating the opioid problem for a moment?
It's a really important part of our overall strategy as a department, and then on each individual U.S. Attorney strategy. to employ our civil attorneys, really the best and brightest attorneys working in our offices in many ways. They're very comfortable working with very complicated and sophisticated litigation matters. They're very used to conducting intensive investigations of violations of federal law. And they're also, I mean, they wield a pretty big stick when it comes to civil penalties and remedies. So finding ways for them to contribute has been relatively easy, I would say, because there are statutory remedies that are in place that we can use and we have used right away. So the Deputy Attorney General referred to, under the Controlled Substances Act, that we have the availability of injunctions to stop prescribing or to stop the filling of prescriptions for healthcare professionals. That was an authority that was not used until this administration. We've done that successfully to cut off prescribing by doctors, and you heard that we've done that with respect to pharmacies as well. And why is that important? It's important when we have joint investigations that are underway. So day one, we may have a search warrant executed at a doctor's office, but we're not yet in a position to prosecute somebody. So what happens in the interim? Well, if we don't force that doctor to give up their DEA number, they're going to continue to keep prescribing. That is their bread and butter. That's how they're putting money in their pockets. So we can bring in our civil attorneys, file a separate civil lawsuit, and cut off that doctor's ability to prescribe the same day that we execute that search warrant. And then we can take our time and go through the evidence in a thoughtful way and determine what kind of charges we can bring against that person eventually. But that's been a real boost to us to stop the harm right away, and we could not do that without our civil attorneys. We could not do that without the civil division here at Maine Justice, in particular the Consumer Protection Branch, which has been a great ally to many of us out in our districts to come up with strategies on not only identifying healthcare professionals who are prescribing way outside the responsible practices that they should be employing, but also in working through some of those relatively thorny legal issues that accompany the use of some of these underused civil remedies. And so it's been a real huge help to us out in the districts to be able to rely on the expertise that resides here in Maine Justice.
Great, thanks, Justin. So Brian, we have great people in the department. We've got a significant challenge we're facing. We've talked about some of the tools that can be used, and you and the people in your division have actually used some of these tools effectively. But how specifically have you marshaled those people, those prosecution theories to deal some blows to our adversary?
Thank you, Seth. I mean, it really has been an all-tools approach, as folks have mentioned, in the criminal division, whether it's narcotics and dangerous drugs going after large-scale traffickers, CSIPs on the dark web, the MLARs to deal with following the money and dealing with what we now see in the area of cryptocurrency, which has crept into this space as well. But the DAG mentioned the biggest initiative that we have in the division, which is ARPO, the Appalachian Regional Prescription Opioid Strike Force, which is modeled after our healthcare fraud strike forces. And we took 15 lawyers, established relationships in a little 10 or 11 districts. It's Southern Ohio, Northern Alabama, all of Tennessee, all of Kentucky, West Virginia, Western District of Virginia, surged lawyers into those districts to work hand in glove with prosecutors on the ground, AUSAs on the ground, to start moving cases against doctors and other medical professionals in the manner that I've described earlier. The initiative was announced in October of 2018, but really didn't get started until January of last year. So we've been at it for a little over a year. And in that region, the DAG mentioned some numbers. I'll give you the updated numbers. We've charged 73 defendants across the Appalachian region. 64 of those defendants are licensed medical professionals, and 48 of those 64, so more than half of the defendants, were prescribers, individuals with a DEA number able to write prescriptions, responsible for more than 50 million pills in those districts. Of our, so far, 73 defendants, we've had 24 guilty pleas. We've been to trial in one case, and we're 1 for 1, have yet to lose a case, and we are going to continue to press in those districts to bring cases quickly against medical professionals who are engaging in this behavior, to stop the behavior as quickly as we can. It's been a great partnership not only with the U.S. Attorney's offices, but with our partners at HHS and state health boards of health, because while we're prosecutors, we're not social workers. It is important to remember that this is a public health crisis, and it needs to be treated as such. And the DAG mentioned what we did as we put ARPO together was to ensure that patients, when they showed up at their doctor's office, as we were carting the doctor away who was responsible for illegal prescriptions, that those patients were treated as victims, and we marshaled the resources at the state level to help them get treatment if that's what they wanted, and certainly to direct them to a doctor who was going to actually take care of them and their medical needs, as opposed to treating them like a drug dealer treats his victims.
Thanks, Brian. So Justin, we're just about winding down, and I just want to send the last question your way, because it sounds like we got great people, we've got some good tools, we've made some successes, but there's always room for improvement with what we've got and what we could have. So on that question of what could we have, do you see that there are potential legislative tools or other tools that would be materially helpful to you and your colleagues and others on the panel in meeting this challenge?
Really, the number one priority, as I see it, is a permanent extension of the fentanyl analogs ban. And that's important for a number of different reasons. The first and foremost is that the illicit manufacturers of fentanyl analogs, they know exactly what the chemistry is, and they know exactly what our law is. In the minute, literally the minute, that we no longer are in a position to enforce on the federal level our Controlled Substance Act violations against those drug dealers, they will fill that gap. And you will see an explosion in the deaths associated with fentanyl analogs. And so for me, a 15-month temporary extension is very helpful, obviously, in the short term, but a permanent ban and a permanent extension of the scheduling of fentanyl analogs would be ideal from where we sit in our districts. That would be the number one thing on the list.
Well, thanks very much, Justin, and thanks to everyone on our panel, and thanks to all of you in the audience who are truly bringing this fight to our adversary. Thanks for coming to recognize the importance of this issue to the department and, of course, to the communities that we all serve. So, Amanda, thanks again for putting this together. And am I correct that we have a 15-minute break following? Okay, so thank you all very much.